Hey guys, tonight we're squeezing ourselves into a crumbling little room where the air smells like wet dust and the walls loom with the color of baked mud. You kneel down carefully, so you don't knock anything over, because everywhere you look, clay tablets are stacked like precarious towers ready to avalanche at the slightest breath. Your fingers brush against one, cool, rough, and still etched with the careful, spidery writing of a world long vanished. You've landed in a Babylonian library, where the concept of silent study is replaced by the grumble of scribes and the faint crackling of drying clay. No shiny wood shelves here, just heaps of hardened mud, and if you're thinking you could survive a day cataloging this mess, think again. Between the constant dust storms, the occasional rat scurrying underfoot, and the real possibility of the ceiling caving on your head, you'd probably clock out before noon. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, where are you tuning in from tonight? Drop your location and local time down below. I love seeing where you all are in the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You brush aside a veil of ancient dust and scoot deeper into the library, past clumsy stacks of tablets arranged by, well, who really knows what system. Some were slim and compact, others the size of a small tray, all molded by hand and inscribed before being left to dry in the sun or a kiln. These were not books you idly pulled off a shelf. Each one was a hardened effort of many hours and blistered fingers. And as you awkwardly crouch, you notice that the floor isn't even flat, just packed earth warped from centuries of use. Historians still argue whether these rooms were intended as true public repositories or simply storage spaces for elite scholars. What's not in dispute is that Babylon was one of the earliest places where written knowledge was hoarded in physical form, not on scrolls or paper, but on slabs of baked clay. The musty air carries the faint mineral tang of ancient riverbanks. You picture some poor scribe, knees cracking as he kneels for hours, scratching into wet clay with a reed stylus, each wedge-shaped cuneiform symbol painstakingly pressed. No word processors, no editing, one wrong stroke and you're scraping the whole thing smooth and starting over. Try not to imagine the existential dread when the scribe realized halfway through a complicated king's decree that he left out a vital line. And the funny part? After all that, these precious clay documents were often just piled against the walls. There were no alphabetized shelves, no convenient card catalogs. Tablets were grouped roughly by subject or maybe by the size of the tablet. Historians still argue whether this was some proto-library system or just pure survival instinct. The room's only lighting comes from a narrow slit of a window, and you quickly realize how treacherous things must have been at night. Maybe that's why so many ancient libraries have records of sudden fires, not just wars and looters, but someone knocking over an oil lamp in the wrong aisle. You shuffle forward, brushing against a stack that teeters dangerously. Maybe the ancients knew their storage methods were precarious, or maybe they thought clay was invincible. Spoiler, it wasn't. Flooding from the Euphrates and Tigris was a constant threat. Some tablets hardened into near rock after baking in the sun, but others turned to mush at the first kiss of river water. Still, for all the hazards, there's something endearing about this chaos. You can almost hear the scolding of a head librarian, arms crossed, glaring at a junior scribe who mislabeled a tax record tablet and filed it with astronomical observations. In a way, this dusty labyrinth was the heart of Babylonian knowledge, history, myths, legal codes, hymns, recipes, even medical manuals full of advice like rub your head with crocodile fat for a headache. Which, you have to admit, sounds slightly worse than the headache itself. Somewhere beyond these crumbling stacks is a corner dedicated to kingly decrees, the ancient equivalent of bureaucratic memos, and you realize that even back then, humanity had figured out how to produce mind-numbingly boring paperwork. It's humbling, really. Even across thousands of years, you're here, crouched in a dim, claustrophobic room, tracing your fingers across the same clay that someone's long-dead hands shaped and inscribed. It's like a whispered connection across millennia, a quiet reminder that even if the walls tumble and the floods rage, sometimes knowledge finds a way to outlast us all. You shuffle deeper into the cramped space, feeling the coarse grit of the floor bite into your knees. Ahead, a low archway reveals another room, a little larger, but not by much, and there, stacked neatly on broad benches made of sun-baked brick, are more tablets. You can almost hear the sizzling heat that once filled these rooms, because these libraries weren't just filled with clay, they baked it too. Babylonian printing presses were about as DIY as it gets. After a scribe scratched a wet clay slab with their stylus, the tablet had to dry. Sun drying was fine, until a sudden dust storm whipped by. So, clever Babylonians built mud brick ovens, essentially giant domed kilns, where temperatures could soar high enough to harden the tablets permanently. You can imagine some ancient teenager, tasked with fire duty, nodding off and accidentally incinerating a week's worth of work. Historians still argue whether these kilns were part of the library complex or external, more communal ovens shared by neighborhoods. Either way, it meant a lot could, and did, go wrong. Tablets cracked if the heat was uneven, and sometimes entire batches exploded if moisture was trapped inside. Imagine working for days on a treaty between city-states, only to have it shatter like an overbaked cookie. Worse, these clay books were flammable, sort of. While the clay itself didn't burn, the reed styluses, wooden drying frames, and oil lamps scattered everywhere did. Fires could start easily, spreading through libraries faster than gossip at a royal banquet. Babylonian libraries might not have had marshals checking for fire codes, but they sure needed them. The kilns themselves weren't precision-engineered marvels either. They cracked, smoked, and sometimes collapsed without warning. You wouldn't find a friendly caution, hot surface sign. One careless step and you could end up branding your toes with centuries of soot and ash. Makes you appreciate modern air conditioning, huh? As you crouch by one of these ancient ovens, you can still smell a faint mineral scent baked into the bricks, a reminder that clay, while seemingly permanent, carries its own frailties. The scribe's work wasn't finished when they pressed the last mark. The real gamble came with the fire. And yet, somehow, enough of these fragile records survived, not just accidents of chance, but because these people were obsessed with permanence. Even when materials failed them, the Babylonians' stubbornness did not. They believed knowledge was sacred, powerful, and, more practically, necessary if you wanted to win a land dispute or cast a spell to ward off your annoying neighbor's evil eye. You inch further in, careful not to knock over a pile of tablets precariously balanced on the cracked oven rim. The tablets, when finished, varied wildly in size and shape. Some looked like small bricks, others were more like giant thumb drives. Big or small, round or rectangular, they were catalogued, well, sort of, based on their use. Oddly enough, these shapes mattered. Historians still argue whether specific shapes were reserved for particular kinds of texts, round for letters, rectangular for treaties, thick for astronomical calculations. It's as if the Babylonians anticipated the modern obsession with formatting but without the luxury of tabs or bullet points. And in the midst of all this ancient chaos, imagine this, a scribe leaning wearily against a kiln, brushing clay dust from his robes, grumbling about deadlines. The king wants 20 more copies of the Code of Hammurabi by next week. As if writing the world's first legal code wasn't pressure enough, now you had to mass produce it, one muddy tablet at a time. You glance at a cracked fragment by your foot. If you squint, you can just make out the faint wedge-shaped marks that record a prayer to Ishtar, the goddess of love and war, a woman who, if you believe the tablets, probably didn't approve of sloppy penmanship either. The kiln sits cold and abandoned now, but you can almost hear it crackling, almost feel the blistering heat radiating from its thick walls. A reminder that while we fret over lost emails and corrupted hard drives, Babylonian scribes faced much hotter, sweatier stakes. You shuffle sideways, careful not to kick a loose shard of clay skittering across the floor, and find yourself in a space that feels more intentional. The clutter is still there, sure, but it's organized clutter. Tall, uneven stacks of tablets tower like squatting statues, and you realize the Babylonians had their own peculiar system, organizing by shape and size. There are the thick, square blocks, heavy as a bag of bricks, containing royal decrees and treaties. Next to them, slimmer, palm-sized pieces probably inscribed with everyday things like sales receipts or grocery lists, 2 goats, 3 jars of barley, paid in full. Historians still argue whether this method was deliberate policy or just the easiest way to prevent the tablet towers from collapsing. After all, try stacking 100 lopsided tablets by subject alone and you'll see how fast chaos invites itself over. You bend closer and notice how the bigger tablets form a kind of crude barrier, almost penning in the smaller, flatter ones. Clever, really. The weight of the bigger slabs keeps the wobbly ones from sliding out of place. It's ancient shelving, minus the shelves. A dusty smell hangs in the air, thick and grainy, and you can practically taste the centuries pressing down. These librarians weren't just clerks, they were structural engineers with a hint of gambler. Every stack was a silent bet against time, gravity, and the occasional careless elbow. Of course, no system is perfect. Imagine an ancient librarian watching a scribe haul a fresh batch of tablets into the room. Where to put them? Not by date, not by author. No, just slot the thick ones with the thick ones and hope for the best. It sounds absurd now, but you try keeping track of 5,000 clay documents without a single bookshelf or database to your name. You glance around and see that the walls themselves seem to lean inward, as if the room is exhaling under the tablet-weighted pressure. You can almost imagine one of these towers keeling over like a slow-motion avalanche, clay splintering, text fragmenting into illegibility. And yet, somehow, this messy method worked. For centuries, Babylonian libraries managed to preserve epic poetry, kingly edicts, and complex astrological charts using nothing but clever stacking and a whole lot of prayer. You wonder if the librarians had favorite stacks, maybe a don't-touch pile where the most sacred or scandalous tablets were kept safe from nosy scholars. One thing is clear, this wasn't a place where you casually plucked a book off a shelf. To access a specific tablet, you'd have to sift and dig like an archaeologist, fingers dusted in clay powder, trying not to sneeze and cause a minor landslide. There's a certain beauty in it, though. In a world where we swipe and scroll, where one wrong click can make an ebook vanish into the void, there's something grounding about these stubborn little towers of mud and sweat and time. You can almost hear a librarian sighing with quiet pride as they rest-hack a toppled pile, reshaping order from chaos one tablet at a time. You back away carefully from the leaning towers of clay, not wanting to test their loyalty to gravity any more than necessary. As you ease into another low-ceiling chamber, something catches your eye, tiny symbols etched not onto the tablets themselves, but onto little clay tags dangling from crude reed cords or resting atop the piles. Babylonians, it seems, weren't content to leave their libraries a total guessing game. They had a system, a primitive catalog of sorts. Historians still argue whether these tags represented early attempts at a classification system or were merely ad hoc labels. Either way, you can't help but grin at the thought, the world's first version of the Dewey Decimal System, scribbled into mud. The tags were simple, a tablet's title, the subject, or sometimes even the owner's name. You'd think this would make retrieval easier, but imagine trying to decode a series of half-erased squiggles while squinting in the dim glow of an oil lamp. Oh, and remember, no vowels in Sumerian Akkadian script. Good luck telling Tar Marduk's agricultural almanac apart from Tar Marduk's astrological observations when all the vowels are basically figure it out yourself. Still, it's oddly comforting to know that even 4,000 years ago, people struggled with labeling things properly. You squat down and imagine a frazzled librarian, hunched over, trying to tie a reed string around a slippery clay tag without smudging the writing, muttering curses under their breath. No waterproof ink, no lamination, one rainstorm or careless spill from a leaky ceiling and the tag would melt into a featureless blob. And yet, despite the primitive tools, the system kind of worked. You needed a copy of the Epic of Gilgamesh? Well, you'd still have to dig, but at least you weren't flipping tablets at random like an ancient version of Guess Who. The scribes were clever, too. Some devised numeric codes to indicate genre, legal, religious, administrative, which must have made sense then, but now read like a toddler smashing a calculator. Historians still argue whether these codes were universal or customized to each library, making visiting a new archive a bit like trying to find the restroom in a foreign airport. Lots of pointing, a few missteps, and a whole lot of hope. It wasn't just the scholarly elite who used this system either. Kings, priests, merchants, anyone with enough wealth to own more than a few tablets, likely had their own mini libraries, complete with tiny clay tags. Imagine flexing on your neighbors by inviting them over to show off your vast collection of agricultural tax records. Yes, Taram, those 2 shelves are just my barley yield records. No big deal. You kneel down and pick up a tag that's miraculously intact. The symbols are faint but sharp, a testament to a scribe's steady hand and a reed stylus honed to a perfect point. As you turn it over, a little puff of ancient dust floats free. It's strangely intimate, this small scrap of bureaucracy reaching across thousands of years. Proof that even in the grandeur of Babylon, knowledge wasn't just sacred, it was organized, however haphazardly. As you replace the tag and rise to your feet, careful not to disturb the delicate balance of history around you, you can't help but appreciate their effort. It's a reminder that even back then, people wanted to know where to find the good stuff. They just had to invent the library catalog, one squishy, clay-smeared step at a time. You shuffle sideways, stretching your back, careful not to knock over another precarious stack, and step into a part of the library that feels less formal, less orderly. Here, the floor is the library. No fancy shelves. No carved niches. Just vast mounds of tablets spread out like a city made of baked mud. Babylonian shelves weren't shelves at all. They were, quite literally, the ground. You might think it's barbaric, but try stacking thousands of clay rectangles on wooden shelving when humidity and termites exist. Plus, mud brick walls weren't exactly known for supporting extra weight without, collapsing dramatically. Historians still argue whether libraries were intentionally designed this way or if floor storage was simply the default because, frankly, it worked. You crouch down and run your fingers over the uneven terrain of knowledge, epic poetry to your left, agricultural records somewhere under your right foot. It's a treasure trove, if you have a map. Which you don't. Nobody did. Instead, you navigate by feel and experience, hoping the mud floor hasn't warped the tablet piles too much. There's a crude order here. Heavier, more important legal records cluster near the walls. Lighter, more expendable writing, love poems, minor contracts, sprawls freely nearer the center, like nobody quite knew what to do with it. You half expect to stumble across a scribe's miscellaneous pile, ancient humanity's favorite filing system. The smell here is thick, dust, clay, and a hint of mildew. You can almost hear the shuffling of feet as ancient scribes tiptoe around their work, sandals brushing the tablets, issuing whispered curses when they knock a document out of place. And imagine trying to read anything in this room. Oil lamps flickering, shadows dancing across the walls, and you crouching like some ancient yoga practitioner, squinting at wedge-shaped cuneiform in the gloom. The Babylonians weren't much for comfort. No padded chairs, no reading tables. You read hunched over on the ground, knees aching, dust clinging to your robes, the risk of a minor mudslide ever present. Not exactly the plush library reading room vibe you'd get at a modern university. But it worked. Despite the dust and the dark and the sheer physical inconvenience, Babylonian libraries became storehouses of legal codes, scientific observations, medical treatises, prayers, and myths. It wasn't just about preserving texts, it was about preserving civilization. You glance down at a tablet near your knee, its corner broken off centuries ago, the cracks forming spiderwebs across its surface. If you look close enough, you can still make out part of a hymn to Shamash, the sun god, an ancient plea for light, pressed into clay, lying abandoned in the dark. There's a kind of poetry to it, don't you think? The floor creaks under your shifting weight, except it's not the floor creaking. It's the subtle groan of ancient clay under stress, whispering a reminder, this system only worked as long as everyone was extremely careful. Which, judging by the number of broken shards littering the corners, not everyone was. You take a breath, tasting the dry air, and wonder, how many centuries passed with people kneeling exactly where you are, bent over the weight of words they couldn't bear to forget? In a world without paperbacks, Wi-Fi, or cloud storage, the Babylonians turned to the earth itself, clay and fire and prayer, to remember who they were. No shelves. No order as we'd recognize it. Just ground, gravity, and grit. And somehow, against all odds, it worked well enough that you're here, now, breathing in their dust and reading their words. You rise slowly, brushing clay dust from your knees, and take in the room around you. If you're picturing calm, tweed-jacketed librarians whispering SHHH, you can forget it. Babylonian librarians were a different breed altogether, gruff, dusty, and probably nursing a collection of impressive back problems. The life of a Babylonian librarian wasn't all that glamorous. These were scribes, first and foremost, trained in the delicate art of cuneiform and the less delicate art of wrangling thousands of fragile clay documents. They didn't sit behind counters. They knelt, they crawled, they stacked, and they scolded, especially the junior scribes who didn't know an omen tablet from a trade contract. Historians still argue whether librarianship was considered an esteemed position or just another tedious bureaucratic task. One thing is certain, you wouldn't want to trade places with them. The job required you to be a master of multitasking, half scholar, half janitor, with a thick skin for complaints and a steady hand for the endless repairing, recopying, and organizing of the brittle clay inventory. You crouch again and imagine the daily grind. You're summoned to organize a newly delivered shipment of tablets from a conquered city, trophies of war, stacked haphazardly in reed baskets, coated in the mud and blood of foreign lands. Lucky you. Now you get to sort and tag them before the king shows up demanding to know if you've found any scandalous political secrets yet. And don't think you're avoiding manual labor. These tablets aren't light. Carrying an armload feels less like a literary pursuit and more like a CrossFit session. Plus, your fingernails, permanently packed with clay dust. Not that you had a manicure to ruin, this was ancient Babylon. Your tunic's already a patchwork of stains anyway. As you imagine the typical librarian, maybe she's a stern older woman with the patience of a saint and the scowl of a royal guard. Or maybe he's a gangly apprentice, forever misplacing tablets and getting scolded by the master librarian for filing medical texts under hymns. Either way, it wasn't a cushy job. It was sweaty, dusty, exhausting work. And thanks to the complete lack of ergonomic furniture, your knees and back aged at triple speed. It wasn't just grunt work, though. These librarians were walking databases. No index cards, no search engines. Everything lived in their heads, the location of specific treaties, the subtle differences between agricultural tax codes, the entire pantheon of Sumerian gods and their appropriate hymns. Imagine your boss barking, "Find the lunar calendar tablet from the reign of King Ammisaduqa," and you had to know exactly which pile to dig into. And then there were the patrons. Kings, priests, visiting scribes from other cities, all demanding, all certain that their request was the most urgent. And you, humble librarian, kneeling in the dust, biting your tongue, trying not to lose your place in the mental map of this chaos. As you imagine the scene, you can almost hear the scrape of clay on clay, the low murmur of scribes at work, the sharp bark of reprimands when a stack collapsed. You picture a librarian pausing, wiping sweat from their brow, glancing around the room with a resigned sigh before returning to the endless task of maintaining a clay empire of knowledge. And what kept them going? Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the understanding that these brittle tablets weren't just records. They were Babylon's legacy, its memory, its heartbeat. They weren't just mud, they were meaning, hardened by fire, inscribed by calloused hands. So the next time you grumble about organizing your bookshelves or alphabetizing your spice rack, just remember, at least you're not doing it on your knees in a dust-choked room, wrestling with 50-pound tablets, and praying the roof doesn't cave in. You drift toward a far corner of the library, where the light is thinner, the air somehow even dustier, and the stacks lean at more alarming angles. But here, you notice something curious, tiny clay tags tied with twisted cords not just to the tablets, but also to entire stacks. Babylonian librarians didn't just tag individual texts, they tagged collections. It's hard not to appreciate the ingenuity. Picture this, a heap of agricultural records could be marked by a tag shaped like a barley stalk, or a stack of royal decrees might have a tiny embossed seal of the king. Think of it as ancient Babylon's version of genre stickers at the library, except these weren't colorful stickers, they were fragile lumps of clay dangling from reed strings that could, and often did, snap if you sneezed too hard. Historians still argue whether these clay tags were strictly utilitarian or if there was a little pride involved, tiny works of art that signaled, hey, we care about this mess looking slightly organized. Some scribes even took it a step further, inscribing small summaries or keywords onto the tags to give a quick preview of what lay inside the stack. You bend down and spot one tag that looks like it barely survived a millennium-long tumble. Squinting, you make out a rough translation, tax collection records, barley and livestock, 5th year of King Sansullina. Catchy, right? Just rolls off the tongue. Babylonians didn't invent waterproofing, though, so during flood season, when the Tigris and Euphrates decided to throw their annual tantrums, these tags would often dissolve into shapeless blobs. Picture a librarian's horror watching their carefully catalogued clay library slowly turn into a swampy mess of anonymous tablets. The ancient equivalent of your hard drive crashing, only wetter and grittier. Despite the flaws, these tagging systems were pretty advanced for their time. They gave scribes a fighting chance in the face of growing collections that sprawled across royal palaces, temple complexes, and even private homes of the wealthy. No public libraries back then, knowledge was a luxury good, jealously guarded by priests, kings, and aristocrats who loved to flex their literary muscles. You can't help but smile at the thought of an ancient scholar showing off his private library. Yes, that's my collection of Sumerian love poetry. Oh, those? Just a few obscure astronomical calculations I dabble in while I'm not sipping date wine. And the librarians? They had to manage it all. Catalog it. Repair it. Track which scribe borrowed which tablet, no library cards, just memory and perhaps a clay receipt if the transaction was particularly high stakes. You can imagine the librarian squinting suspiciously at a scribe returning a tablet. Did you drop this in the river? Smells like frog's pond. Even though clay tablets seemed sturdy, they chipped easily. Edges flaked. Corners crumbled. Whole lines of text could vanish with one clumsy knock. It wasn't just about finding a tablet, it was about keeping it intact long enough for someone else to read it. Tagging the stacks helped prioritize which piles needed the most protection, and probably which ones the librarians would sprint to save first when the roof leaked or a fire broke out. You pick up one of the fragile tags, feel its feather-light weight, and realize you're holding a librarian's lifeline, a thread connecting chaos to order, meaning to memory. In a world made of mud and dreams, it was these tiny tokens that kept Babylon's knowledge from dissolving into the dust. You squeeze past a broken bench and shuffle into yet another room, this one grander, with remnants of carved bricks hinting at past opulence. The air is somehow a little cooler here, and the stacks of tablets, though still wildly haphazard by modern standards, are noticeably denser, thicker, richer. You're standing in a private library. And not just any private library, one that belonged to someone with serious clout. See, Babylon's kings weren't about to leave literacy to the temple scribes and priests. No, they needed their own personal collections, curated and guarded like treasure. Wealthy nobles followed suit, building private libraries stuffed with clay tablets detailing everything from agriculture to astrology, from medicine to myths. And because you didn't share knowledge lightly in ancient Babylon, these personal archives were fiercely guarded. Think VIP section, but make it mud. Historians still argue whether access to these collections was granted to scholars or was strictly a royal family flex. Most signs point to the latter. If you weren't in the king's good graces, or you didn't share blood with the noble who owned the library, you'd better have a solid bribe ready. Maybe a prize goat. Maybe a favor that would haunt your family for generations. You shuffle forward and run your fingers along the stack. These tablets are different, larger, denser, and more refined. The etchings are deeper, more precise, almost as if the scribes were ordered to really take their time. You can picture it, a hunched-over apprentice scribe sweating bullets as he painstakingly scratches in the umpteenth invocation to Marduk, trying not to mess up and risk a few quality years working sewage duty instead. Private libraries weren't just for show either. Some kings were obsessed with knowledge. Not just to look smart, but to wield power. Laws, omens, star charts, this was data with teeth. Control information, and you controlled the narrative. Sound familiar? And then there's the furniture, or lack thereof. Even in these fancier rooms, there were no reading chairs, no fancy desks. You'd think the king of Babylon might want a plush seat while browsing his clay bestsellers, but nope. Everyone's still crouched on mats or knelt, probably cursing under their breath after 15 minutes of reading hymns in uncomfortable silence. You glance around and notice that even here, the storage was brutally practical. Tablets stacked along walls, maybe placed on low benches made of wood or stone, if you were lucky. Wealth bought quantity, not necessarily comfort. The collection wasn't limited to local knowledge either. Babylonians were shameless knowledge hoarders. Diplomatic missions often came home not just with treaties but with stolen wisdom, foreign tablets, captured libraries from rival cities. Knowledge was power, but it was also loot. You brush your fingertips across a tablet thicker than your forearm. It's a king's personal decree, painstakingly recorded, likely copied a dozen times to ensure his glorious edicts didn't vanish into thin air, or mud. There's a grim sort of irony here. Despite the king's efforts, so many of these libraries eventually did vanish, swallowed by time, war, and the slow, inevitable grind of water and earth. Still, standing here, surrounded by the relics of ancient intellectual vanity, you can't help but admire the ambition. To collect so much, to preserve it with fire and clay and sheer stubbornness, it speaks to a human desire that transcends time, to know, to remember, to leave something behind that says, I was here. You exhale softly, the dust swirling in the dim light. In this cramped, crumbling corner of a vanished empire, the dreams of kings and the toil of nameless scribes still linger, waiting patiently for someone like you to stumble in and listen. You shift your weight, trying not to make the ancient floorboards, or what passes for them, creak too much. Around you, the room feels alive with a strange tension, as if the clay tablets themselves are holding their collective breath. You know what that feeling is? It's gravity. It's the weight of 1,000 unsteady stacks silently begging you not to sneeze. Because here's the thing, Babylonian libraries were in a constant battle against collapse. You think your poorly stacked IKEA bookshelf is risky? Try living with walls of clay bricks, unstable floors, and piles of brittle tablets, each one liable to tumble at the slightest provocation. Historians still argue whether more libraries collapsed due to shoddy building techniques, natural disasters like earthquakes, or just plain bad luck with clumsy scribes. Odds are it was a little bit of everything. The Euphrates River didn't do them any favors either, regularly flooding and undermining foundations until whole wings of libraries quietly sank into silt and oblivion. You creep toward a wall where a collapsed pile lies in tragic disarray. A crushed tablet peeks out from the rubble, half its cuneiform text erased by the brutal kiss of centuries. You almost feel bad for the long-forgotten librarian who must have watched, powerless, as their careful order dissolved into a mess of fractured knowledge. Stacking these tablets wasn't just a matter of dumping them in a pile and hoping for the best. No, it required skill, experience, and, if we're honest, a bit of ancient magic. Thicker tablets went at the bottom, thinner ones carefully balanced on top. A well-stacked tower could stand for decades. A poorly stacked one? It could take out a scribe's foot or worse, his dignity. The floor was no savior either. Made of packed earth or uneven bricks, it offered little stability. And clay tablets, while tough, were far from indestructible. One wrong move, and they'd chip, crack, or outright shatter. It was like balancing dominoes made of pottery. And then there's the human element. Libraries weren't empty museum pieces. They bustled with activity. Scribes hustled in and out, kings' envoys arrived with new documents, priests came searching for ancient incantations. Every extra footstep, every careless bump, added to the risk. You pause and tilt your head, imagining the chaos when a tower finally gave way. A loud, dusty crash. A spray of clay shards. A few colorful Akkadian curses thrown into the mix. The librarians storming over, red-faced, hissing about weeks of work destroyed in seconds. Probably a punishment or two handed out, no free passes for clay carnage in Babylon. Still, there's a strange kind of resilience in it all. Despite the constant threat of collapse, these libraries thrived. Knowledge didn't vanish overnight, it just adapted, survived, stubbornly refusing to be buried forever. Even today, archaeologists excavate ruined Babylonian sites and find the remains of these libraries, the clay tablets cracked but still legible, their messages defying time itself. You glance up at the swaying stacks surrounding you and smile. You have to respect it, the chaos, the fragility, the relentless human desire to hold onto something bigger than ourselves. A whole civilization, balanced precariously on towers of mud and dreams. You edge your way around the fallen pile, careful not to crush anything further, like stepping through the wreckage of someone's forgotten thoughts. Ahead, a low doorway yawns, leading you into a smaller, hotter room where a dozen clay tablets lie scattered across the floor. No order here. Just tablets, dust, and the heavy scent of old earth. Welcome to the scribal sweatshop. Yes, if you imagine libraries as serene temples of study, think again. Before any tablet graced the chaotic mounds you've been navigating, someone had to create it. And that someone was usually a scribe, hunched over, sweating, elbow-deep in wet clay, and under no small amount of pressure. Historians still argue whether scribes were honored craftsmen or glorified clerical workers. In truth, they were probably a bit of both, revered for their skill, but also ground down by the relentless demands of their society's thirst for records, laws, stories, and spells. You crouch and run your fingers across a half-finished tablet, the clay still rough and uneven. You can almost see the scribe sitting here, stylus in hand, muttering under his breath as he etched line after painstaking line. No shortcuts. No Control+Z. One bad stroke and the whole tablet had to be scraped smooth and started over. Mistakes weren't cheap, they were humiliating and time-consuming. The room would have been stifling. No windows, no ventilation, just the thick smell of clay and sweat. Maybe a few low oil lamps casting flickering light that turned the scribe's world into a haze of shadows and dampness. Your knees would ache within minutes, your back, within seconds. And yet, these scribes could work for hours, churning out everything from love poetry to bureaucratic ledgers. And this wasn't quiet work either. Scribes argued, grumbled, whispered curses when clay cracked or styluses snapped. The master scribe, an older, grimmer figure with ink-stained fingers and the patience of a stone, would pace the room, barking corrections, maybe doling out the occasional sharp rap on the knuckles for sloppiness. You pick up a small tablet inscribed with what looks like a receipt, barley owed to the temple from a farmer 3 villages away. Glamorous stuff, right? But alongside these humble records, scribes also copied down epics like the Epic of Gilgamesh, arguably the world's first action hero story, philosophical treatises, and astronomical charts. The duality is almost comical. By day, the scribes juggled grocery lists and tax ledgers. By night, they immortalized kings and gods. Still, the life of a scribe wasn't open to just anyone. It took years of grueling training, memorizing hundreds of cuneiform signs, mastering the art of cutting and shaping clay tablets to the perfect thickness, and learning the stylistic flourishes that could make the difference between a legible decree and something that looked like a toddler's doodle. You glance at a cruder tablet in the corner, maybe the work of a novice, the lines wobbly, the characters uneven. He was probably terrified of the master scribe glowering behind him. You imagine the kid muttering prayers to Nabu, the god of scribes and wisdom, for a steady hand and a merciful teacher. Of course, the master scribes were under pressure too. Libraries didn't fill themselves. Kings demanded copies of treaties. Priests needed copies of incantations. Merchants wanted their contracts meticulously recorded. It wasn't a factory, not exactly, but it sure smelled and sounded like one. As you place the cracked tablet back on the floor, you realize something humbling. Every record, every epic, every dry legal text and lofty prayer you've seen stacked up in the main rooms, it all began here, in sweat and dirt, scratched out by exhausted scribes hoping they didn't misspell the king's name and earn themselves a quick trip to the dungeons. Knowledge didn't come easy in Babylon. It came at the cost of calloused hands, strained eyes, and worn-out backs. And yet, somehow, it came etched forever into mud and fire. You step lightly out of the suffocating scribal chamber, back into the cooler main halls of the library, where the stacks huddle like ancient sentries in the gloom. And then it hits you, not every scribe was confined to the sweatshop. Some had an even harder job. These were the scribes who doubled as librarians. Yes, in Babylon, being able to write wasn't enough. You also needed the mental agility to remember, and I don't mean your to-do list or your cousin's birthday. I mean the position of every single tablet in this endless labyrinth of clay. Because without real shelving systems, without catalog drawers or computers, knowledge was stored in the most fallible system imaginable, human memory. Historians still argue whether there was a formal system of memorization, or if librarians simply developed individual methods over years of practice. Maybe they categorized information by subject, maybe by the year, maybe by the weight of the tablet or the texture of the clay. Nobody knows for sure. All we do know is this: you didn't find the tablet, you found the librarian, and the librarian found the tablet. You step closer to a long, low stack and imagine a scribe librarian kneeling here, eyes closed, tracing mental maps of where treaties were stored versus astronomical records, recalling not just content, but location. The entire library was a living web inside their heads. It sounds impossible, right? But imagine growing up with it, starting as a young apprentice, running errands in the library, memorizing where things were as naturally as breathing. Your brain, shaped by years of dusty repetition, would become a living card catalog. But here's the kicker: they didn't just memorize the layout. These scribes had to understand the texts too. It wasn't enough to know where the grain tax tablets were. You had to know which one dealt with barley exports from Uruk and which one covered wheat imports from Mari. That way, when the king's steward stormed in demanding a specific decree, you wouldn't fumble around like an ancient intern on his first day. You trail your hand along the edge of a tablet, its surface still faintly ridged from the pressure of a reed stylus, and try to picture the pressure. One misplaced tablet could mean disaster, a missed tribute, a bungled sacrifice schedule, a king's rage unleashed on the wrong scribe. And imagine the updates. Every new batch of tablets meant new information to file away mentally. No sticky notes. No for later folders. Just your poor, overworked brain, struggling to make room for more laws about oxen and fields, more hymns to Ishtar, more star charts warning that Mars was up to no good again. You can almost hear the murmured mantras of the librarians, walking the rows in the evening to refresh their memory: tax ledgers, northern wall, astronomical omens, low bench, western side, royal decrees, under the cracked ceiling beam. In a way, these scribes were human time capsules, repositories of not just data, but of civilization's fragile memory, encoded in gray matter rather than silicon. And when they passed away, without careful succession planning, entire chunks of knowledge risked vanishing with them. You pause, breathing in the heavy, clay-laden air, and realize something strange. It's not just the tablets that survived the centuries, it's the system. Memory, passed from brain to brain, generation to generation, scribes training new scribes to carry the torch. It's humbling to think about. Long before servers, clouds, and flash drives, Babylon's librarians memorized their way into immortality, one mud tablet at a time. You move carefully past a leaning wall of tablets and step into a part of the library that feels heavier, thicker air, thicker silence. The weight of knowledge here isn't just metaphorical. This, you realize, is where the real power was kept. The kind of tablets that didn't just record events, they shaped them. Babylonian libraries weren't neutral archives, they were political weapons. Whoever controlled the information controlled the narrative, and whoever controlled the narrative controlled everything else. You think today's media wars are cutthroat? Imagine it in a world where whoever had the most clay could literally rewrite history. Kings hoarded libraries the way dragons hoarded gold. After a conquest, soldiers didn't just sack temples or plunder palaces, they raided archives. Knowledge was a trophy. Astronomical charts, legal codes, religious rituals, all stolen and carted home to Babylon, where they were rebranded, recopied, and claimed as local wisdom. Historians still argue whether this was strategic policy or just a very nerdy kind of looting. You crouch down by a stack of cracked tablets. Imagine a conquered city's most sacred hymns, ripped from their temple shelves and dumped here, translated awkwardly into Akkadian, stamped with the king's seal, and paraded as if they'd always belonged to Babylon. Cultural appropriation, ancient style. But it wasn't just about stealing knowledge, it was about controlling who could know. Access to libraries wasn't free or open. Scribes were gatekeepers. They decided who read what and when. Need to consult an omen tablet before launching a military campaign? Better hope you're in good standing with the librarian priests. Otherwise, the gods' opinions might stay conveniently undiscovered. You trace a line of cuneiform along a tablet's edge, the symbols sharp but strangely elegant. It's a royal edict, probably copied dozens of times, distributed to regional governors to ensure everyone remembered who was in charge. Libraries made sure history didn't just happen, it was curated. And then there's the flip side, censorship. We like to imagine ancient scribes as noble preservers of truth, but they were also the first editors. Scribes could accidentally omit awkward details, tweak records to flatter a king's ego, erase mentions of a disastrous harvest, or even swap a deity's name depending on political alliances. One heavy tablet you lean against feels slightly different, finer clay, tighter script, more delicate stylus work. This wasn't made in haste. It was carefully crafted propaganda. A record of a king's grand temple building campaign that, based on archaeological evidence, probably never actually got finished. But hey, what the library says goes, right? And because tablets were so laborious to produce, few would dare to question a written record. The logic went something like, it's on clay, so it must be true. If you think about it, this was the first hard copy fake news, baked, not printed. Imagine the political strategist scribes of the day, sitting around low tables, arguing about how best to spin a bad omen. Can we just say the eclipse meant great favor instead of impending doom? No one's going to double check. Who even reads lunar omens anymore? You chuckle softly at the thought, sending a little swirl of dust into the lamplight. Human nature hasn't changed much. Babylonian kings understood what every modern politician knows. Control the story, control the people. You stand again, feeling the palpable weight of the room, and you realize, this wasn't just a library. It was a throne room of ideas. A silent battleground where power was won not by swords, but by styluses pressed into clay. You shift your weight, careful not to lean too hard against the unstable walls of history around you, and step deeper into the maze. But here's the ugly truth no king or scribe liked to admit. Clay, for all its baked bravado, was surprisingly fragile. Preserving wisdom in Babylon wasn't guaranteed. It was a constant gamble. Every tablet you see, every epic, every law code, every ode to a long-forgotten god, was at war with the elements. Babylon sat between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and while that made it fertile and powerful, it also made it wet. Floods could wipe out a carefully organized library in a heartbeat. Clay tablets, if not properly fired, were about as durable as a soggy granola bar once the water came rushing in. Historians still argue whether some libraries intentionally flood-proofed their storage areas or if surviving collections are purely the result of blind luck. You kneel by a tablet, noting the telltale signs of water damage, softened edges, faint warping where once straight lines have buckled. Imagine it, a century of careful inscriptions undone by a single wet season. Your grand literary achievements, dissolved into the earth like they never existed. But water wasn't the only enemy. Clay tablets that didn't get properly baked in a kiln remained vulnerable, brittle, crumbly, and prone to decay. A badly fired tablet could crumble in your hand like dry cake. Even the best fired ones weren't safe. Time alone eroded them, especially if they were handled too often or stacked poorly. And then there were the rodents. Oh yes, libraries weren't just a paradise for scholars, they were an all-you-can-eat buffet for mice. Not because they ate clay, even mice have standards, but because they loved the dark, dusty, cluttered spaces. Plus, the occasional tablet made with a straw-reinforced clay mixture. Mice found that absolutely delicious. You nudge a fragment near your foot, revealing teeth marks along its side. Somewhere in ancient Babylon, a rodent earned itself a snack and unknowingly chewed through a piece of human history. There's something bleakly poetic about it, all the brilliance, the ambition, the aching, sweat-soaked work of the scribes, at the mercy of rivers, rats, and rot. But it wasn't just environmental threats. Humans had their own way of screwing things up. Libraries fell victim to wars, fires, and plain old neglect. A new king might not care about preserving the treaties of his predecessors. Whole archives could be dismantled or abandoned, left to the mercy of the elements simply because someone got bored or bitter. Babylon's librarians fought a never-ending battle against these forces. They tried oiling the tablets to make them more water-resistant. They stored them on higher ground. They copied important works again and again, hoping sheer redundancy would be their salvation. Still, most of what was written down has been lost. A depressing but inevitable truth. The idea that we only know a sliver of what was created, that for every epic of Gilgamesh we have, a dozen other sagas have crumbled to dust, is enough to make you sit back on your heels and sigh. Yet, standing here, surrounded by what remains, you can't help but feel a strange hope. Against impossible odds, some of it did survive. Words pressed into clay by dead hands, surviving floods, fires, rats, and empires falling into ruin, just waiting to be read again. You run your fingers lightly over the faint script of a water-warped tablet and think, not bad for a mud brick. You leave the water-warped tablets behind, easing into a darker, quieter part of the library. Here, the air feels thicker, heavier, not from dust, but from something more unsettling. You glance around and notice the tablets are different. The inscriptions are sharper, the symbols stranger, the patterns less about accounting and law and more about, well, magic. Yes, Babylonian libraries weren't just storehouses for royal decrees and tax records. They also hoarded something more mysterious: spells, incantations, omens, curses. Rows upon rows of clay tablets dedicated to bending the will of gods and spirits. Historians still argue whether these magical texts were archived separately or simply jumbled in with everything else, like misfiled horror novels in a cozy library. But there's no arguing the atmosphere they created: chilling, dense, electric with ancient superstition. You crouch by a stack labeled, not in words, but with an image, likely a small, carved depiction of a god holding a staff. It's the library's quiet way of saying, here be magic. The tablet on top looks innocent enough until you get closer. Its surface is carved with rows of strange invocations, repetitive syllables and symbolic patterns that scholars believe were meant to summon, bind, or banish forces unseen. You feel the instinctive itch at the back of your neck, the same one you get when you realize the horror movie character shouldn't have opened that basement door. Welcome to Babylon's supernatural section. These texts weren't written lightly. Crafting a proper spell meant choosing the right clay, the right time of day, the right ritual before etching the words. Sometimes the scribes even mixed their clay with specific herbs or oils thought to enhance the tablet's power. You'd think writing a curse would be a simple matter of, "Dear demons, please smite Gary," but no, it was practically a science. You pick up a smaller tablet, lighter in your hand than it looks, and squint at the writing. It's a healing incantation, a plea to drive sickness out of the body. It mixes invocations to several gods with instructions for rituals: fumigate the sick room with cedar smoke, chant 3 times under the light of the full moon, offer a libation of beer. Honestly, not the worst prescription compared to modern waiting rooms. But there's another tablet nearby that makes you hesitate. It's cracked, brittle, but the symbols are intact enough to read, a curse, aimed at thieves. Whoever stole a tablet from this library, or misplaced it, could expect divine retribution, boils, blindness, exile, the works. Babylonian librarians didn't mess around. You can almost picture a scribe carefully stacking these spell tablets, muttering protective prayers under his breath. Knowledge wasn't just power, it was dangerous. Mishandle it, and you risked more than just a lecture, you risked the wrath of the gods themselves. And imagine being the poor junior scribe assigned to this section. Hours spent among curses and incantations, every creak of the clay underfoot a reminder that the invisible world was just a poorly worded spell away from breaking through. You'd be lighting extra lamps, glancing nervously over your shoulder, maybe slipping a little amulet into your tunic just in case. You set the tablet down carefully, no point in risking ancient Babylonian vengeance for the sake of curiosity, and glance around once more. Here, among the stacks of spells, you realize how deeply intertwined knowledge and belief were. To a Babylonian, there was no separation between learning and magic. Writing something down wasn't just recording it, it was making it real, binding it to the world in baked clay. You step back into the dim hallway, feeling the heavy air lighten behind you. One last look at the cursed shelves, a final shiver down your spine, and then you move on, grateful that whatever spells once lived here seem content to stay asleep. You slip away from the spellbound corridors, shaking off that lingering sense of invisible eyes watching you, and find yourself in a wide, open space, if you can call it that. Here, tablets are sprawled out in a deliberate, circular pattern on the floor. No benches, no tables, no chairs. This, you realize, is Babylon's idea of a reading room. Forget plush seats and polished tables. In Babylon, if you wanted to read, you sat on the ground, cross-legged if you were lucky, kneeling if you wanted to stand up again without sounding like a creaky gate. Mats woven from reeds lined the floor, though the luxury of padding was usually reserved for scholars of higher rank. If you were an apprentice or a lowly clerk, you'd better enjoy the sensation of woven reeds digging into your knees. Historians still argue whether these reading rooms were open to all scholars or only an exclusive few. It's likely only a tiny, educated slice of the population could even read cuneiform, let alone be trusted to handle the fragile clay. Literacy wasn't a casual skill, it was a career, a lifelong commitment that started young and involved years of mind-numbing practice and, undoubtedly, a fair share of tears. You ease yourself down onto an imaginary mat and try to imagine the scene, a dozen scribes kneeling in a circle, each hunched over a tablet, whispering translations, debating interpretations, the occasional reed stylist scribbling furiously on fresh clay nearby for note-taking. No murmured gossip here, no idle chit-chat. The work was serious, the atmosphere reverent. Oil lamps, carefully placed around the room, gave off a steady, low light. Not too bright, clay didn't like heat. Imagine the eye strain. You'd squint and lean in, shadows flickering over the neat rows of wedge-shaped marks, while your back screamed for mercy. You haven't known discomfort until you've spent 6 hours reading legal codes about cattle ownership and kneeling position. There were rules, too. You couldn't just wander in and start pawing at the tablets. You'd have to request a tablet through the librarian, probably the same surly figure who memorized the entire layout of the place, and wait for it to be fetched. Mishandling a tablet wasn't just frowned upon, it was a punishable offense. Accidentally breaking one? That was a fast track to working off your debt repairing the library's leaky mud brick walls for a year or two. You pick up an imaginary tablet and balance it carefully on your knees. They weren't shaped for ergonomic reading, these slabs. They had heft. Your arms would tire, your legs would cramp, and your mind would wander, perhaps to whether this was why so many Babylonian scribes depicted themselves with hunched shoulders and serious faces in their carvings. Chronic clay readers' fatigue was probably a thing. And yet, despite the discomfort, there was something almost meditative about it. No buzzing phones, no clattering keyboards, just you, your breathing, the faint hiss of oil lamps, and the slow, deliberate process of soaking in the wisdom of the ancients. Imagine reading an astronomical omen tablet, tracing the careful predictions about eclipses and the fates of kings, fully aware that somewhere, a real king was holding his breath for the outcome. Imagine reading a hymn to Ishtar, feeling the ancient cadence of the words like a heartbeat, connecting you to a scribe who lived and died 3 millennia before you. No desks, no chairs, no glossy covers. Just clay and quiet determination. It's humbling, really. In a world obsessed with speed and convenience, you sit here in the dust, knees aching, eyes straining, and think, this is where it all began. You rise slowly, knees popping, and give a respectful nod to the ghostly scholars still bent over their work. You owe them a debt of gratitude, not just for what they preserved, but for reminding you that real knowledge is earned, not downloaded. You shuffle stiffly out of the reading room, stretching your cramped knees, and find yourself in a corridor that feels oddly hollow. The walls are cracked, the floor uneven, and only a scattering of broken clay litters the ground. There's a somberness here, a whisper of absence. This is where the lost libraries of Babylon make themselves known. Not all of Babylon's archives survived the test of time, of course. In fact, most didn't. Historians still argue whether the greatest collections were lost to war, to neglect, or to the slow, inevitable crumbling of mud brick walls. Some suggest that hidden libraries, vaults of secret knowledge, might still lie buried under layers of silt and rubble, waiting for the patient hands of archaeologists to reveal them. You crouch near a pile of shards, the remnants of what was once a proud archive. You can't help but imagine the moment it all came crashing down, a tremor under the earth, a flash flood breaching the walls, or maybe just time itself taking its toll. One day, the roof buckled, and the clay towers collapsed, turning a kingdom's worth of knowledge into gravel. And it wasn't just one disaster. Babylon faced countless invasions and sackings over its long, turbulent history. Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, they all took their turns marching through the city's gates, and they weren't exactly respectful houseguests. Libraries, seen as the symbolic heart of a city's power and culture, made tempting targets. Burn them, and you didn't just erase documents, you erased identity. You kneel, picking up a shard with the edge of a cuneiform character still visible. You wonder what tablet this once was. A prayer? A law? A map of the stars? Now it's just a fragment, like a single letter torn from an ancient, unknowable book. Some scholars dream of the hidden libraries that might still be out there. They imagine sealed rooms, collapsed under mud brick but miraculously intact, like ancient time capsules. Perhaps somewhere in the wreckage lies a complete version of a text we only know by name. Perhaps a long-lost epic, or a forgotten king's boastful chronicles, or a library of spells so potent they were hidden away for fear they'd fall into the wrong hands. You can't help but smile at the thought, modern-day Indiana Jones's insensible shoes and wide-brimmed hats, brushing away centuries of dirt to uncover secrets that haven't seen the light of day since Hammurabi was still issuing laws about oxen rights. But there's a bittersweetness to it too. The Babylonians built for eternity, firing their tablets to last the ages, and trusting clay with their highest hopes and deepest fears. And yet, even fired clay is no match for the ruthless patience of time. As you place the shard back among its fallen kin, you realize the true fragility of human achievement. No matter how strong our empires, how clever our inventions, how meticulous our libraries, nothing lasts forever. Not stone, not clay, not even memory. And yet, some do. A fragment here, a tablet there. Pieces, scattered like seeds, waiting to be found, pieced together, read again. Each survivor a stubborn little whisper echoing across the millennia, we were here. We mattered. You straighten, brush the dust from your hands, and leave the lost library behind, stepping softly so as not to disturb the silence it has earned. You step back into the main halls, and almost immediately your foot taps against something unexpected, rounded, smooth, different from the usual sharp-edged tablets. You crouch down and realize it's a loan tablet. A contract. Proof that Babylonian libraries didn't just hoard knowledge, they loaned it out. But not in the casual, card catalog, late fee sort of way you're imagining. Borrowing a clay tablet in Babylon was a serious affair. You didn't just stroll in, grab the Epic of Gilgamesh off the floor stack, and wander home whistling. No, you had to pledge. You had to swear. You might even need a witness. And yes, you better believe there was paperwork, more clay tablets, documenting the whole transaction. Historians still argue whether these loan systems were designed primarily for scholars or were mostly political favors, gifts of knowledge granted by kings to their most trusted advisors and priests. Either way, the process was formal. You could be required to swear an oath before a temple priest, vowing to return the tablet in good condition and on time. Failure to comply? Public shaming wasn't out of the question. You lift the contract tablet carefully. The cuneiform rows are tidy and precise, the ancient equivalent of fine print. It details the borrower's name, the lending institution, probably a temple or royal archive, the expected return date, and often a set of dire consequences if you dared to default. Imagine the librarian solemnly reading out the terms while you nervously clutched your tunic, return by the full moon or face the wrath of Nabu. These weren't empty threats either. In a world where omens and curses were taken dead seriously, having a library curse on your head was no small matter. You didn't just risk bad luck, you risked divine intervention, sickness, misfortune, maybe even a particularly vengeful goat infestation. And if you lost or damaged the tablet, forget fines. You might have to compensate with livestock, grain, or, if you really mess up, hard labor for the temple. That's right, one clumsy accident, and you could be pulling irrigation duty for a few sweltering summers. Makes your local library's overdue fines seem downright merciful, doesn't it? Yet, despite the risks, people still borrowed tablets. Scholars needed access to texts for their research. Priests needed sacred hymns for rituals. Astrologers needed star charts to forecast the king's fortunes. Knowledge was too important, too powerful to stay locked away, no matter the price of borrowing it. You imagine the careful ritual, a scribe selecting a requested tablet, wiping it gently with a damp cloth to clear the dust, handing it over with both hands like a sacred relic. The borrower, hands trembling slightly, tucking it into a linen satchel, whispering a quick prayer for its safe return. You smile at the scene because really, it's not so different from the modern day. We still sign our names on library cards, still pledge, silently, sometimes thoughtlessly, not to damage or lose what we borrow. We still understand that borrowing knowledge is a privilege, not a right. You place the loan tablet gently back on the floor and stand, brushing dust from your palms. In a world without mass printing, without e-books, without backups, every clay tablet was irreplaceable. To borrow one was to borrow a piece of civilization itself, and you treated it with the awe and terror that deserved. You walk on, careful where you step, thinking about the long chain of readers who once knelt here, clay tablets in hand, hearts pounding not just from the weight of knowledge, but from the weight of responsibility. You move slowly, mindful of the ancient loan tablets scattered across the floor, and step into a new space. It's different here, denser, heavier with the dust of centuries, but something else too, diversity. You look closer and realize the cuneiform on these tablets isn't uniform. Some signs seem tighter, sharper, others are broader, almost flowing. Babylon wasn't just home to Akkadian scribes. This was a metropolis, a crossroads of languages, cultures, and ideas. And so, tucked away in corners like this one, you find what might be history's first foreign language section. Historians still argue whether the different language tablets were carefully curated or just dumped together, like the clearance bin at a struggling bookstore. Either way, Babylon's libraries boasted texts not only in Akkadian but also Sumerian, the scholarly language of old, kept alive like Latin in medieval Europe, and Elamite, Hittite, even Egyptian. You squat beside a cracked tablet and trace your fingers over the symbols. It's not Akkadian, not even close. This is Sumerian, long dead by the time many of these libraries flourished, but still revered. Scribes learned it as a kind of intellectual badge of honor, much like scholars today sweat through Latin or ancient Greek just to flex a little harder at dinner parties. Imagine the challenge. You're a Babylonian scribe in training. Not only do you have to memorize thousands of Akkadian signs, but you also have to master the older, trickier Sumerian language, learning the intricacies of a grammar system that made modern linguists weep tears of sympathy. And for what? Bragging rights? Job security? Probably a bit of both. You can almost hear the grumbling of students long past, hunched over clay tablets, mouthing strange syllables under their breath, trying to keep the ancient words straight in their heads. Maybe whispering complaints about how nobody even speaks Sumerian anymore the way modern students grumble about conjugating Latin verbs. But the library's multiculturalism wasn't just about language snobbery. It reflected Babylon's ambition. The kings and priests wanted more than just local wisdom. They wanted everything: medical recipes from Egypt, omens from Anatolia, agricultural treatises from Susa. The best of the best, gathered under one muddy, sun-baked roof. You glance around and spot a tablet thicker and darker than the others. Egyptian? Maybe. Some tablets were imported, others copied laboriously by Babylonian scribes trying to preserve, or maybe steal, the precious knowledge of neighboring civilizations. Intellectual piracy wasn't born yesterday, after all. Handling these foreign texts wasn't easy. Translating them was even harder. There were no handy dictionaries, no Rosetta Stones, yet. Scholars had to rely on painstaking study, scribal training, and a generous dose of educated guesswork. And if they messed up, well, it's not like anyone could fact-check them. You step further in, feeling the deep hum of scholarly ambition. Here, amid these forgotten fragments, was the ancient world's first attempt at globalization. A hunger for knowledge so fierce it ignored borders, cultures, even languages. Babylon didn't just conquer cities, it tried to conquer ignorance. You bend down and lift a tiny fragment, its edges worn smooth by time. The symbols are faint, almost ghostly. Whatever language it once spoke, it speaks now only in whispers. But that's enough. Even now, even here, the voices of faraway lands and long-dead scribes still murmur in the dust. You set the fragment back with a kind of reverence and straighten, feeling a little awed. In an age before printing presses, before global networks, before Google Translate, the Babylonians built their libraries like bridges, crossing rivers of language and culture, determined to gather the world into a single, fragile, muddy embrace. You shuffle carefully past the foreign language section, your mind swirling with the sheer scope of it all. But as you step into the next room, the mood shifts. The walls sag, the clay stacks are fewer, and the air feels hollow. Here lies the inevitable end to even the grandest dreams: decline, decay, disappearance. Babylon's libraries, once vibrant hubs of scribal genius and royal ambition, didn't fade all at once. It was a slow, grinding unraveling. A missing roof tile here, a leaky wall there. Scribal schools lost funding. Libraries lost patrons. As the city's fortunes waned, so too did its love affair with clay. Historians still argue whether the libraries fell primarily because of political upheaval, economic downturn, or just the natural decay of a sprawling city stretched too thin. Probably all of the above. You can't build eternal empires on river mud and optimism alone. You crouch beside a toppled stack, just a few broken remnants left. You can almost see the slow-motion disaster: fewer scribes, fewer librarians, fewer students. No fresh hands to dust the tablets, repair the shelves, recatalog the chaos. The oil lamps snuffed out, one by one, until the great halls stood silent. Nature crept in. Wind carrying fine dust that settled like a shroud over the clay. Rain finding every crack in the sun-baked brick, seeping in, turning the floors to muck. Termites and rodents scuttling through abandoned rooms. The city, once the beating heart of Mesopotamia, became a crumbling skeleton. And humans, of course, did their part. Invaders took what they could carry. Locals, needing bricks more than books, tore down walls, repurposed mud brick for new homes, leaving the libraries to sag and melt back into the soil that had birthed them. You pick up a half-dissolved tablet, its once proud inscriptions blurred to near-nothingness. Maybe it was a hymn once. Maybe a legal code. Now it's just mud pretending to be memory. But here's the twist: what seemed like failure was, paradoxically, the very thing that saved what we know today. Mud brick collapsed, yes, but it collapsed onto the tablets, burying them under protective layers of debris. Floodwaters filled rooms, yes, but in doing so, hardened some tablets further, baking them into near indestructibility. 1,000 years after the last librarian swept the floors, archaeologists began to dig, their fingers brushing aside centuries of dirt to reveal clays still marked with the thoughts of the ancient world. Cities lost, languages dead, empires dust. But the words, somehow, impossibly, endured. You stand and dust off your palms, looking around the broken, fading space. It's humbling, really. No matter how much we build, no matter how carefully we plan, time wins. Walls fall. Memories fade. Only fragments remain. And yet, it's the fragments that tell the story. You walk on, slower now, more careful, more reverent. Every broken piece you pass isn't just a ruin, it's a survivor. A testament. A whisper from a world that refused to vanish completely. Babylon may have crumbled. Its libraries may have vanished. But its clay, its words, its dreams, they refuse to be forgotten. You step through a crumbling archway, the final threshold between the past and the present, and find yourself in a strange kind of sanctuary. Here, scattered in the dust like seeds waiting to sprout, lie the accidental time capsules of ancient Babylon. It's almost ironic. The very forces that the librarians and scribes feared most, flood, fire, collapse, turned out to be their unlikely saviors. When the mud brick walls gave way and roofs caved in, when the Euphrates spilled its banks and washed through the streets, these clay tablets were buried, hidden, protected. Not lost, preserved. Historians still argue whether Babylon's preservation was pure luck or some divine act of cosmic generosity. After all, it wasn't designed that way. The tablets weren't entombed intentionally. They were abandoned, left to drown in silt and time, the scribes who once cared for them long gone. And yet, against every odd, they survived. You crouched beside a tablet half buried in dust. It looks fragile, delicate, but you know better now. This humble slab of hardened mud has withstood invasions, floods, fires, earthquakes, neglect, and centuries of silence. The words pressed into its surface, the dreams, the prayers, the taxes, the curses, remain. You imagine the day an archaeologist brushed aside centuries of dust and blinked in astonishment at the rows of cuneiform revealed beneath. Imagine the quiet thrill, the recognition that these weren't just artifacts, they were voices. Babylonian voices, crackling through the long corridors of time. You pick up the tablet carefully, cradling it like a newborn. It's lighter than you expect, but heavier with meaning. Somewhere in its lines could be a law that shaped a civilization, a poem that once made a king weep, or a star chart that guided ancient hands to plant or to pray. And isn't that the real magic? That even now, even after so much has been lost, these ancient stories whisper their secrets to anyone patient enough to listen. You set the tablet down gently and rise. Around you, the library breathes, not in the way of the living, but in the way of memory, deep and patient and eternal. In the end, the Babylonians didn't just organize their libraries with clay. They organized them with hope, with a stubborn belief that knowledge mattered, that it was worth preserving even if the world around it fell to ruin. You step away, leaving the tablets to their slumber, knowing they'll wait. They've always waited. And maybe, just maybe, they'll outwait us too. Now, as you back slowly out of the ancient library, feel the dust settle, soft and gentle, like a blanket pulling itself up over the world. The cool air wraps around you, heavy with the scent of old earth and long-forgotten dreams. You picture the tablets, resting silently in the dark, patient as stars. The scribes are long gone, their cities reduced to whispers in the sand, but their words remain, steady, unwavering, waiting for another curious soul to stumble upon them. Let your breathing slow. Let your muscles soften. Imagine the crumbling walls fading into the background, the flickering oil lamps guttering into darkness, until only the soft hum of history remains, lulling you deeper into stillness. You are a traveler of time, a listener of ancient echoes, a keeper of stories that refuse to be forgotten. Now, close your eyes. Let the weight of centuries fall away. Rest easy, knowing that some things, like dreams written in clay, can endure forever. Sweet dreams.